The Vietnam War by SilasHum11VietnamWar. During World War II, America and the Soviet Union had actually been fighting as allies with each other. But as it ended, because of political and other differences, they began to go to war with one another. The US weren't agreeing with communism and did not like Joseph Stalin, who was the current leader of the Soviets. These were the main reasons that posed such a threat on what Americans stood for, and ultimately led to the beginning of the Cold War. The Cold War started in 1947, soon after the end of World War II. But it was not just a war between America and the Soviet Union, it affected the world. Indochina, North and South Vietnam, as well as North and South Korea were all some of the participants in this war. This event caused more than 3 million deaths, but only 58,000 of those were American. The French had arrived in early 1858 to colonize, but Vietnam had been fighting for their freedom ever since. At first, Ho Chi Minh was just a political activist, but early on fled to Vietnam to travel, spending time in France, Russia, and China. Throughout all of his travel, he maintained his focus on the study of communism. Once he had arrived back in Vietnam, he contacted the American government to hopefully gain some help in order to fight off Japan and France. America provided them with weapons and other supplies. On September 2nd, 1945, Ho Chi Minh proclaimed Vietnam independent and went on to become president. In 1949, Bao Day and Ho Chi Minh both wanted a united Vietnam, but differed on how they wanted it to look. Bao stuck with a more traditional Western focus, where Ho wanted to take after more communist-run countries. The Soviet Union from the start was trying to take over France, and France was trying to colonize to Vietnam. So with the help of American soldiers, France sent thousands of men to Vietnam trying to stop them from falling under communist rule. Meanwhile, in 1950, communist North Korea launched an attack on South Korea, and the domino theory was at its height throughout the country. This was the idea that if one nation had fallen to communism, the others would follow, and North Korea was already in hope to unite and spread communism to the south. And Vietnam adopted this same mindset. The French later set up a military base in Dien Bien Phu, feeling so confident that any confrontation would end up in a victory, but were later proven wrong with 50,000 Viet Minh soldiers surrounded them in a valley and won, after the French surrendered from a 55-day attack. An armistice was then signed shortly after, splitting Vietnam into two parts along the 17th parallel. This left civilians with a short 300 days to relocate to their preferred destination. In the end, meaning 900 refugees moved to the south, seeking a life free of communism. Since the beginning, Dwight D. Eisenhower had been the current president of America, and at this point pledged a small alliance to South Vietnam and Diem. With this extra training, Diem's soldiers came down hard on the Viet Minh, making up to 100,000 arrests, in which many were killed or tormented. In 1960, Diem's enemies in South Vietnam created the NLF, National Liberation Front, to conspire resistance towards their government. Once John F. Kennedy became president, his advisors prompted him to send ground troops into Vietnam in order to help the South push the Viet Cong back. Keeping in mind the domino theory, JFK was also told that the Vietnam cannot fall to communism, but refused to send in troops, instead sending Green Berets over to the South as trainers for the Vietnamese. Kennedy also doubled the military funding and sent in armored carriers such as napalm strikes in order to take out the Viet Cong's crops and resources. In South Vietnam, corruption and the suppression of Buddhism became very severe. The 73-year-old monk committed self-inflammation and set himself on fire. After that, more nearby monks fell to the same fate in order to send a message to their government. Ngo Dinh Diem was the president of South Vietnam, but his military generals, who were told the coup would not be stopped by the US, assassinated him and his brother. People celebrated the death of him on the streets. The only question that was left came from who would replace him. Following JFK's assassination on the 22nd of November, 1963, Lyndon B. Johnson, his vice president, took over. Johnson continued to strike the Vietnamese with explosives, but the Viet Cong were also starting to push their attacks. So in March 1965, Johnson sent more ground troops to Vietnam, a decision he had been avoiding. In the beginning of 1966, the Viet Cong now controlled 3/4 of South Vietnam's countryside, moving their weapons and supplies through Laos and Cambodia. There was 12,000 miles of what they called Ho Chi Minh's Trail. This is what they were using while transporting goods. This also gave the Americans the idea of bombing this trail in order to stop the Vietnamese from sustaining itself. 3 million tons of explosives were dropped on the Ho Chi Minh's Trail, falling on most of Laos' portion alone. Johnson sent more men, allowing hundreds of thousands more troops to get ready to deploy. But the Americans weren't just fighting the Vietnamese, but also the terrain, a challenge a new country posed upon them. Booby traps, landmines, and grenades also lay hidden within the landscape of their travel, causing loss of limbs or fatality. At the beginning of 1968, 500,000 troops scattered Vietnam, and America was glancing at a victory in sight. But Vietnam and Viet Cong were planning major attacks of their own once again on January 30th. A 36-hour truce was set into place for Tet, the Lunar New Year, and thousands of ARVN soldiers had gone home for the holidays. 84,000 Viet Cong and North Vietnam soldiers attacked South Vietnam the next day, thinking this would give them an advantage. But of the 48,000 offensive troops, 58,000 were killed, captured, or wounded, and it became an overwhelming victory for the defending American and ARVN forces. On March 31st, 1968, Johnson spoke to the nation on television, announcing that America was to stop bombing North Vietnam and hope that he could eventually get to the negotiation table. Richard Nixon was elected as the next president, but just 3 days prior to the election, President Chu of South Vietnam withdrew from the peace talks unexpectedly. Due to CIA deals in Chu's office and an FBI wiretap in the South Vietnamese embassy, Johnson had found out what had happened. He found out that Nixon and his team were caught in the act of treason, since they had been contacting a foreign power in the middle of the war. Thousands of men were now dying for nothing, and protests continued. But Johnson did not speak about what he had found and Nixon was not charged with anything. Once in office, Nixon began a bombing campaign around Hanoi, known as the Christmas bombing, which killed 1,600 civilians. America seemed to have bombed Hanoi into renegotiating with them, and it took both of them only 6 days to come to an agreement. Prisoners of the war were getting released and American troops in Vietnam were being withdrawn. North and South Vietnam would fight on, and Nixon had pledged to help the South if ever need be, by providing Air Force and other assistance. But in August 1974, Nixon resigned, and Congress weren't wanting to help the South, so they cut their funds and assistance in half, allowing up to 20,000 ARVN troops to leave the military a month. The Vietnamese, after 30 years of war, 2 million deaths, and many villages destroyed, were finally united under a single communist nation. The result of many changes to their government system ended in a large economic drop. People were starving, and eventually 1.5 million people were left to flee. 400,000 of those people ended up making it to America. The Vietnam War ended on April 30th, 1975, and as much as the Cold War did not start the Vietnam War, it definitely played a part and most likely increased its intensity. The Cold War ended up lasting until December 26, 1991, affecting many nations along the way. It was not as much a soldier's war as it was a political war. At the end of the day, I believe we can learn a lot from these events, for it is a crucial part of our history, and one that can hopefully remind us to make better decisions in the future. After all, history repeats itself.